Today, I'm joined by two eminent personalities who come from different backgrounds and approaches towards AI. Let me start with your introduction. First, we have Dr. John Cohn. John is an IBM fellow in the MIT-IBM Watson AI Research Group. He has authored more than 30 technical papers, contributed to 4 books, and has more than 100 worldwide patents. Welcome, John.
Oh, thank you, Nagaraj. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, John?
Doing well.
The second panelist we have is Dr. Reid Blackman. Reid is the founder and CEO of Virtue. He works with companies to integrate ethics and ethical risk mitigation into companies' culture, development, deployment of emerging technology products. Welcome, Reid.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and good to meet you. Good to meet you, John.
Hey, great meeting you, Reid.
So let me start with John. First and foremost, it's always a pleasure to see you. Our conversations always start with like 2 minutes, and then I say, John, can I ask you one more question, one last question, and it goes to like a 30-minute session. So tell us what is happening at IBM and MIT Labs.
Well, it's been great. For me, it's a bit of back to the future. I've been at IBM. I just started my 40th year here at IBM, which is kind of crazy. Came right out of MIT, so as an undergraduate. So in 2018, the end of 2018, when John Kelly, our senior VP, it was after they had just launched this MIT-IBM lab, and he asked me to come and be, what is my role? I think I'm Yoda there, the old guy. Everyone there in our 40-person group is half my age and probably twice as smart. But we're doing a very interesting experiment. It's a 10-year commitment of about $240 million over that period, including the people and the compute, but also the research funding. We have a kind of an interesting model for joint development. We're on the MIT campus, and we're actually moving closer to the MIT campus. We'll be in a new building in April. Or when we can all go back. And we have about 78 joint projects. And so we're not just paying research. All of those projects, which are on the topic of AI, we do joint publication, joint coding, joint patenting. And it's really, really been an interesting thing. Our main topics are AI algorithms. For example, I work on Neurosymbolic. We have new physics for AI, trying to figure out how we're going to make AI scale. We have AI applications in industry, like for finance and healthcare. And then we have AI for public good. So around the kind of content around ethics, et cetera. And so it's been quite amazing. Like I say, back to the future, because I've been circling MIT for 44 years and I can't escape.
That's awesome. It's always something new, something exciting, John. By the way, like I'm a big follower of your blog. I see all your pictures.
Just being part of a nerd.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
But it's great to be here.
Thank you. So Reid, you and I had some very good conversations. Even Reid's conversations go like different ways, like his depth of knowledge and his basic idea or passion towards making ethical, making ethics part of the DNA of an organization. It is something like worthwhile to talk about. So tell us about what's going on, the latest. I know you are working on some HBR articles last time when we spoke.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's sort of the work that I do that is, writing stuff. Before I did all this, before I left academia, I was a professor. I was a philosophy professor for a decade. Plus, of course, the 6-7 years of grad school before that, plus undergrad. So I spent a lot of time reading and writing stuff. And so writing is something that I really still love. So yeah, I've written a couple of HBR articles. I have a couple more coming out. And it hasn't been announced officially yet, but I recently signed a book contract with HBR to write a book on AI ethics, with a focus on how do you not ethically screw things up when you're building AI, building and deploying. So, actually, John, I put it slightly differently than you. So there's the AI for good crowd. And I'm the AI for not bad crowd, the AI for not bad crowd. So there's let's take AI, it's a really powerful tool, and let's do a bunch of good in the world. And that's awesome, that's great, people should do that. But also the people who have, if you like, ethically neutral goals, they're not ethically bad, but they're not sort of noble, they're just fine. We need to hire people, okay, that's good. or it's at least, it's at least not bad. Let's make sure not to run into a bunch of ethical pitfalls along the way. So that's what the book is about, helping organizations actually do that. And then, of course, more generally, what's going on is I work with clients on that sort of thing, right? So from large global companies to startups of various sizes, I help them figure out how do we really integrate ethical standards or ethical risk mitigation into our DNA, into our everyday operations, whether we're talking about product development or the data that we're collecting in HR and marketing, and so on and so forth.
Interesting.
I love that distinction. I love that distinction, for not doing bad.
Yeah.
We'll have, I think there are a lot of common topics between you both in terms of bias, in terms of data ethics, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure those paths will intersect very soon. So John, you have worked on some very interesting natural language problems, right? Problem solving. I always feel that natural language is the first start and the last frontier. If you're able to converse with the system, if the systems are context and ambient aware, that's where I think the general perception is yes, we are there. We are expecting R2D to solve the world. So tell me, what's happening in the natural language processing and understanding?
There's just been so many great advances in natural language processing recently. I can tell you about a project that I'm working on that I'm very excited about. It's interesting, and I think it comes down a little bit to what Reid was saying: is don't do, make things as ethical as possible. One of the things that's clear to us is that the wonderful transformation that natural language processes makes in the world is kind of unevenly divided. There are maybe 20 high resource languages that are very well covered in NLP in terms of, chatbots or, all of the tools that necessarily come with being able to converse with a computer, by text or by voice. But do you have any idea how many languages there are in the world? This surprised me. Well, we have a project called 5,000 Languages, and there are roughly 5,000 spoken languages. And, it's a long tail kind of thing. And so many of these languages are what we would call low resource. They do not have a huge corpus of written data. They do not have a large number of speakers. And what happens is that people who speak these languages, don't benefit in terms of all the advances in technology. And it's pretty pervasive. NLP is starting to be used in all sorts of things, in retail and, taxes, everything. So our 5,000 Languages project is trying to figure out both for the business reasons of sort of digital enablement, how do you provide NLP kind of capabilities? So we're working in geographies like South America, particularly in Brazil, where there are, roughly 500 languages spoken, and some of them only by a small group. So some of those are business, where languages like Guarani are spoken by millions of people, but those people are not able to actually work at the same level with banking, insurance, et cetera, at NLP. So we're trying to figure out how to deal with languages at that level, but also from a kind of a cultural preservation. There's a big interest of not, there are some languages that we're looking at that only have a few hundred speakers. And from a cultural, encouragement, how can we actually capture those languages? What's very interesting from it technically is that the traditional ways of training in NLP is to have a huge amount of labeled data with lots of resources, et cetera, and then you can train these large models, these transformer models, GPT-3, those kind of things. But what do you do when you don't have all of that labeled data? So we're looking at experiments, particularly in understanding, languages of a common lineage. What can I apply from the grammatical constructs in a nearby language? So to do kind of educated transfer learning from other languages that we do have a lot of resources, and then apply those rules so that you make up for the fact that you can't do the normal, supervised learning. So it's very interesting. We're looking at native languages in this country and in Canada. We're looking at Indian, a large number of Indian languages, a large number of African languages, and it's just been fascinating.
That's very interesting. I have one follow-up question on that. So off late, right, if you talk about language, we have come from like talking volumes to like 140 characters, or maybe conversing more through emoticons, right? So in that space, when you talk about, on one side, you are trying to discover and preserve the languages and their sanctity. On the other hand, we are racing towards history in terms of being like almost like borderline hieroglyphics level talking. So how do you like balance and say like, yeah, this is still important and relevant?
Well, I think from the cultural, how do you put a price on, the preservation of a culture? What we're finding though, I think it's interesting because, our intent in our laboratory is actually more on the academic side. So I'm not working on the commercial application. So we're not trying to, bring those very low resource languages into chatbot land, so because they typically are people who are, who are by choice or by circumstance are not, into modern commerce. But I think the idea of, how do you preserve somebody's language? How do you actually boost it? There's so many great stories that we're running into of how, a dedicated group of people are actually starting to teach, going back and trying to reverse all sorts of cultural hegemony, to try to teach the native languages in the schools and to try to build them back up. I think from a technical standpoint, what's also interesting is, trying to figure out how do you actually capture the data that you need in these cases? And oftentimes, I'm thinking of your hieroglyphics point. What we're finding is, in lieu of having a large number of written corpus, we find that actually doing language-to-language translation by looking at a picture, for example, something that's universal, and having someone describe it in their native language, so that the sort of symbolic uplift, what are the actual symbolic constructs, sort of using that as a translation. So a bit like a hieroglyphic, is we're sort of trying to figure out, the universal aspect of what our minds, contain. Natural language sort of does that, but we're actually taking it up one level to sort of using pictorial descriptions as a way of capturing. Not sure I answered your question. There was kind of
absolutely
danced around it a little bit. Yeah.
But absolutely, that makes sense. Reid, first and foremost, you said that you work with a lot of companies, small, medium, even startups, right? What is motivating companies to look at ethics right now? Because there's a lot of talk, you hear about what's happening in Google. What is it? Is it about the branding, image, or like why now?
Yeah. So you're not going to find one. By the way, John, that was all super interesting, and now I have a bunch of questions for you, especially about the universality of how to interpret that. The pictures are interpreted sort of universally in a way that language is not. I want to press you on that at some point, but not now. Anyway, just quickly, two people can look at the same cloud formation, and one sees a duck and one sees a rabbit, or just take the duck rabbit thing, right? So there's issues about interpretability. Anyway, put that to the side. Sorry.
And we actually face that. That's a really interesting question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we should talk about that sometime. Anyway, so there's not one motive, right? So here, I'll give you a bunch of motives. It's important to our brand. It's a competitive advantage to our brand, and we don't want to get found out that it's not real. So we really want to do it. That's one motive. One motive, it's the right thing to do. We have high ethical standards because ethics is important for its own sake. So we want to be ethical. How do we do that ethically? We don't want to be, we don't want to be reckless. So how do we avoid that? Here's another motive. I want to be the leader. I want to be the leading edge of this movement. So it's ego, right? So, and some of it's risk mitigation. Ethics is really important, and I really don't want to get caught with doing unethical stuff. So let's mitigate that ethical risk, reputational risk, et cetera. So whether it's competitive advantage, whether it's risk mitigation, whether it's ego, whether it's, if you like, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, that's a set of motives. And I suspect that those motives and more are present in any individual that I work with, and although it varies, right? So you can, turn up the ego on one and turn down the right thing for the right thing, doing the right thing for the right reason for one person, and for the other person, it's the opposite. And, all you need is enough, if you like, levers sufficiently high across an organization, at least in senior leadership, to make things happen.
So, but the thing is, most of what you described is the intangible part of it, right? Intangibles in terms of like brand name, brand affinity, the image, right? There are a lot of tangible aspects, right? In terms of the cost, the terms of like revenues, or like what it takes effort, it takes people, it takes time
Yeah.
to build an organization to have this kind of ethical standards. Look, how to balance out?
So what's interesting, one of the things that I found interesting in my transition from academic ethicist to something like practicing ethicist or something along those lines, is that in academia, when you're talking about ethics are, if it's unethical, you don't do it, right? It's the final word. Whereas in a business context, ethical considerations are one set of considerations among many, right? In various business considerations. How much money do we have? What are our priorities for Q1? That's not something that, Aristotle is particularly concerned about. So I think that a lot of businesses do a kind of calculation where ethics is in the mix and other business considerations are in the mix. And there's some subset of all companies that engage in those deliberations that think, yeah, this is worth the cost. It's really important to us. And that's not just important for one reason, but for a variety of reasons. And if you are doing something like risk mitigation, then you think it's going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars to restore trust if we destroy it. It won't cost us that much to implement an ethics program and execute on it. So let's do that.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would just say that unfortunately it's the case that, that framing it as a business problem is the way to get the way to both the client and the company behind it, because there are real costs associated with violating that. And I think it's kind of it's a nice thing, because when you can frame it as a business, then you're not just talking about, doing it for good, even though that is in our hearts, it lines up the objectives quite well when you can actually outline the real costs of not doing it.
Yes, that's actually why I don't use the phrase. I try to avoid using the phrase AI ethics and only use AI ethical risk, because that's a language that businesses can understand. They don't understand the word ethics. They'll bend over backwards not to use the word ethics. Sustainability, ESG, mission, purpose, shareholders, not ethics.
See, that's going to be interesting. I'll have a follow-up question for you. So John, coming back to you on neurosymbolism, is it like the first step towards singularity?
Well, I think it's a practical step. Oh, we got to talk about singularity, but let me just talk a little bit about neurosymbolic. It's kind of an interesting, buzzword. What's I kind of go back to my history. Marvin Minsky, who was sort of the father of AI, was also the father of my college roommate. So when I was there, we spent a lot of time talking about symbolic AI. And as you probably know, that AI, this was, the first big meeting on AI was in New Hampshire in 1956. And they started using the term AI. And what that meant until about, 2012 was symbolic AI. So Marvin Minsky would, these theory of mind would have these large symbolic constructs. We went through rules-based system. And as you know, that, AI almost happened at least twice. There were the sort of AI winters where there was huge expectation and then it crashed, because very, very hard to create robust rules-based systems. And even though the idea of neural nets had been around for a long time, it wasn't until 2012, 2013, when people started, developing the computational tools using graphic GPUs, graphic processing units, TPUs, et cetera, that they became technically tractable. Well, when the neural net components became so popular, it sort of sucked all of the minds that way. So everything becomes a neural net, and it's really compelling, right? Our phones, have neural nets because they recognize our faces, et cetera. And it became the answer, whatever the question was. Well, what neurosymbolic is trying to do is kind of go back into all of that symbolic logic, the logical reasoning, and sort of I'm kind of tempted to think about like Daniel Kahneman thinking fast and slow. While the neural net can parse the world very quickly, then trying to figure out how to make neural nets are great for recognizing situations that you've trained on, but not very good for sort of reasoning about new situations. So what we're looking at in the neurosymbolic is really just an architectural statement of using both components, using neural nets to sort of parse the world, make sense of it, sometimes synthesize examples, and then using traceable symbolic logic to then process what you work in kind of an iterative way. And so we're building architectures that make it much easier to combine those capabilities in a less ad hoc way. And in some ways, what you say, well, that is it, helping us towards the singularity. Achieving the singularity isn't part of my business objectives, but I would say if we're advancing towards if we're kind of in a realm of sort of narrow AI now and moving to broad and then eventually to general, the idea of being able to put symbolic logic alongside these neural components and a composition makes it much easier to predict, debug, the sort of explainability of a neural net. Natively is not very good. Why did it miss? Whereas the symbolic logic allows you to sort of codify, trace, question. So using those two solutions in close concert allows you to build things that have more predictable, more trainable, more updatable kind of behavior. And I think that is very important towards building trust, which, is aligned with ethics, that, as we start to advance and relegate more of these decisions to machines, we have to make sure that they're behaving as we would like them to be, ethically, which is a tough problem. I mean, as we go on in this conversation, what do we believe? Do we all believe the same thing? But these constructs of being able to use symbolic logic alongside with neural make it easier to, predict, constrain the behavior of AI. So it's kind of a tool along the way, I would say.
Can't wait. So, Reid, in terms of implementing ethical programs in the organization, what works best? Is it bottom-up or top-down approach? And what do you see?
It's not going to work if you don't have senior leadership behind it. That's totally crucial. So you need senior leadership. One reason that you need it is to have the right kind of oversight. And another reason you need it is to get the right kind of organizational buy-in. And relatedly, you need the right kinds of financial incentives, or at least you need the absence of financial disincentives. So if you don't have those kinds of things in place, you're just not going to get the right kind of buy-in. There's other things that you need for buy-in, like engineers who don't just regard ethics as squishy, subjective, mushy stuff that doesn't really matter for people who are intellectually serious. So you've got to get rid of that. But it's great for the bottom-up stuff is good for getting senior leaders to move on it. But if you don't get the senior leaders to push for it, to endorse it, then you're not going to go anywhere.
Great. I want to follow up with one more question. Last time when we spoke, you talked about the content and the structure.
Oh yeah, sure.
Right? Can you share that thought process with the audience, please?
Yeah. So a lot of people talk about AI ethics, and then they sort of it's a big jumble of stuff, right? So you look at your average framework or something, framework, word that I really don't like very much, but let's get an AI ethics framework, and then it's just a bunch of stuff. You just throw some words at it. Fairness, fairness, privacy, explainability, accountability, transparency, and sort of just a big jumble. So one way that I like people to think about these things is to distinguish between the structure of something like an AI ethics program or framework, whatever you like, and the content. So the structure is just going to be what you put in place in order to answer the question, how do you systematically and exhaustively identify ethical risks of AI? That is to say, throughout development, testing, deployment, and so on. So what are the role-specific responsibilities of, say, data collectors, of engineers, of product owners? When they smell ethical smoke, what's the alarm that they can pull? Who does it go to? Does it go to a deliberative body? How do you determine who's on that deliberative body? What's their jurisdiction or powers? So on and so forth. So that's all structure. That answers the question, how do you do it? How do you vet for ethical risks? And the content question is, what are the ethical risks you're looking to avoid? So we don't want to invade people's privacy. We don't want to discriminate. We want explainable outputs. Maybe there's lots to say about explainability, about whether that's really an ethical issue, as opposed to a sort of whether it's an ethical value or it's an instrumental value to achieve other values that we care about. This sort of gets to what John was talking about. It's a tool by which we can get more predictability, which is good, so that we can make it so that we can predict whether it's going to discriminate, blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's just that. Anyway, so the content answers the question. So while the structure asks the question, the structure of your AI program answers the question, what or how are you vetting for ethical risks? The content issue is, what are the ethical risks that you're looking to identify and mitigate? And you can bring this distinction into relief by imagining a perfect structure instantiated by the KKK. Right, so the KKK is, they say, look, we really care about AI ethics. We want to have a really good structure. Let's make sure that we really want to make sure that we have biased data sets. We really want to make sure that we're ensuring that they're biased in a way that favors the white race. And, we have an ethics committee to make sure that balanced data sets don't get through, et cetera. And they're really good at it, right? So you could have a phenomenal governance structure, but the content is, if you like, all wrong. And so I think that what people should be thinking about when they think about these things is, let's think about structure, let's think about content, and then let's think about what constitutes a comprehensive structure and what constitutes comprehensive analysis or investigation of the ethical risks.
There you go. That's a great explanation.
I really, I really like the way you frame that, Reid. Because I think a lot of buzzwords are thrown at this, but I think something you said, which really resonated with me, is that, I'm a real nerd, went through all sorts of engineering, undergraduate, graduate school. And I think ethics was always considered to be one of those nice to have. But I think that what it really came down to me is sort of teaching a certain humility that, that engineering can often be about certainty, establishing certainty. And I think with ethics, you have to be able to sort of back off of it and say, how could this technology be misused? I do believe that there are people who would intentionally, put ethical problems into a system. I think the example you gave is pretty interesting. Sure. But I think oftentimes, if you look at things like Social Dilemma, the movie, it's kind of unintended and it's sort of a slippery slope. And if you teach the engineers to be always certain and understand their purpose, they become defensive. I think that it's really interesting to see engineering programs around the world start to try to teach ethics. And I think part of it is sort of recognizing that your best intents may still have an unintended consequence. So I think it's really interesting, this sort of bottoms up. It's really great that there are people like you who would sort of inform what the ethics, practical ethics, how do you actually instill ethics into machines in something more than a buzzword way? Because I think that you have to do it tops down, as you said, because you need the support. But bottoms up is, I think, that the technical decisions that may end up being misused or have unintended consequences are created by hundreds of thousands of engineers, hopefully without meaning to be. And I think the more that we can start addressing it there and start having meaningful conversations like you just did, the better off we'll be.
And I think there are sort of two issues that you're drawing attention to, or that we're drawing attention to, which is one, it's how do you get the engineers to buy into the issue in the first place? And that's about why should we take this stuff seriously? And then the second is, if they do take it seriously, what do we need to teach them? And are they the right people to teach? I'm not totally convinced. So what I mean is, the first thing which is to have to do with getting them to understand it as a real issue. Some of them automatically get it, right? Some of them are probably a lot like you, where you're doing cool things. I think this is sort of characteristic of some significant subset of the tech industry, which is why we're having this conversation, which is, we just wanted to build cool stuff. Like, we're nerds who want to build cool things. We didn't realize we were going to do all this harm. That's bad. We should stop that. We need to figure out how to stop that. That's a significant subset, but it's not. I don't think it is the sort of overwhelming majority of technologists. The others, I think, they sort of know that stuff exists. They think it's overhyped. Some of them, they think it's just political correctness. And anyway, they're doing much harder intellectually puzzling stuff. They don't want to figure out that puzzle. And so for them, the thing to do, at least my technique, is to show them how much they don't know about ethics, that it's not squishy, feely, touchy stuff, that ethicists do more than just emote. And so you use the word humility, John, and I think it's really important. So frankly, what I try to do is I try to intellectually humble them within a domain, right? So they can intellectually humble me, coding, data analysis, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know anything of that. I can't do that stuff. But when it comes to talking about ethics, I can show that they don't know, they're not the expert in the room. And that ethics can be intellectually demanding and hard, and they're really hard puzzles to solve. And that's how you can get a bunch of the engineers on board, because then they realize, there's a puzzle here. Oh, that's interesting. And whereas before they thought it was just mushy stuff. The second thing, though, let's say we get them on board. Now, okay, we better teach the engineers ethics so that we can get at least not bad outcomes. And while I think that's part of the solution, it can't be the whole of it, for the simple reason that you can't teach me engineering in a semester or two, and I can't teach you, you can't teach me how to be a great engineer in a couple of semesters, and I can't teach you how to be a great ethicist in a couple of semesters. These things take time. So getting them educated is great, but part of that education is understanding that it's good to have other kinds of experts in the room.
Oh, sure. Totally agree.
So John, I'll go through a common topic based on your last statement. So at any point, like you work with neural networks, adversarial networks, and so on and so forth, do you see at any point AI like going through a self-regulatory process where one neural network is saying, you're not doing right on at least on this portion?
Well, I can answer that at a couple of levels. I mean, at a mechanical level, that's, we use that all the time in things called, generalized adversarial networks. So it's very interesting. GANs, I don't know, they're very common, but GANs are used in a variety of ways where you actually have one AI subsystem that's postulating a situation, and then you have one that's critiquing it. And that technique is used for, generating style transfer. It's used for doing creative, compositions. It's used for synthesizing data, but it's also used for creating deep fakes. And so it's kind of a weird thing, but the idea of it's used for actually both preventing and causing cybercrime, which is kind of ironic. And I think that highlights where you have one AI that's proposing exploits to a secure system, and another one that's trying to critique them and refine them.
Yes.
And it's turned around in the other way, is that the bad guys have that too. So I think that the idea of actually having two AIs, which are, one is the oversight of another, is mechanically done all the time. The question is, and I think to Reid's point, I think it really is important that you have the experts in the room, because I really take what you said to heart, Reid, is, I don't think anybody in the engineering side is a trained ethicist, will not likely be. I think it's very interesting, nuanced problem, especially when there is no ground truth for ethics. Good and bad are kind of subjective topics. And so if we all agree on a particular set of ethics, I think it's really important to have someone who is independent. I mean, I think it's as much about what they know, but as their role, because oftentimes when we're designing something, our goal is, like you said, make cool stuff, make business, etc. And I think it's really important to have an impartial entity that is actually thinking differently, is not in the, both has a different objective, their objective is to make things as ethical as possible, to keep the company safe from ethical harm, for causing ethical harm, for generating business risk due to bad ethics. And if you put that responsibility on the same person who's creating them, you get I don't know what the word for that is, but you become constructively self-deceptive, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I really think that, and I don't see any reason mechanically why you couldn't have the oversight, in the sort of GAN model of having an ethical observer as an AI, but that is not a magical solution, because there is no ground truth for ethics. And sometimes there are unintended consequences of using two AIs. I think humans are going to need to be in the loop for this for a long time, for the long haul. Yeah.
Okay, so I've got lots to say. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for me to say it all, and I'd put everyone to sleep. But I think it's a substantive claim to say that there's no ground truth for ethics. And when people think that, then it's just, okay, well, if there's no ground truth, then it's all just made up. It's all just,
no, it's not.
It's all subjective. I mean, maybe you mean something else by there's no ground truth, but you might think that there are certain ethical truths, like genocide is bad or something like that. And there are reasons for, then the question is, well, why would you think that there's no ground truth to ethics? And you say, well, people disagree, but yeah, sure, people disagree about all sorts of things. And the general principle, if people disagree about X, then there's no truth to the matter on X. That's obviously a false principle. Anyway, that's a bigger conversation I'm happy to get into at some point. The other thing is that I totally agree with you, John, that having an independent oversight is crucial. So when you think about the way that medical IRBs work, for instance, before you're going to do medical research on human subjects, you have to get approval from an IRB. IRBs are, of course, required by regulation now in the States anyway. But you have to have, it's required by regulation that at least one member on the IRB be not associated with the organization. They have to be independent to avoid conflicts of interest. And I think we definitely need the same thing for AI. There needs to be some kind of ethics committee within an organization, or call it an AI IRB. There should be at least one member of that AI IRB that is independent. I wouldn't think, and I do think that we will need humans on that for a long time, probably forever. I would be shocked if we could figure out an AI that could properly vet for ethical risks. Surely there'd be some true positives, but there'd also be lots of false negatives and false positives. I'd like to know the rates of those and how they compare to humans. And I'd be shocked if they did better than a trained ethicist. I could be, let that be a big challenge. And let me be proven wrong.
I know, like Reid has so many blogs on subjectivity and objectivity, like on the ethics.
Oh, yeah,
like,
yeah.
I read that. So like, I'm like, as I mentioned, like this conversation, we need like 3 hours conversation, like to have this. So yeah. One last question to both of you. Like, so John, like in terms of, there are so many students and audience who want to learn AI and other stuff. Where do you start? How do you start?
Oh, wow. Well, that's actually, Nagaraj, that's a big part of my being, is that I think that if you really want to get people engaged in AI and be able to make responsible decisions, to understand the long-term impact to future of work, their own health, how different jobs will be displaced, et cetera, you have to get people interested enough to actually have more meaningful, nuanced conversations that can't be completely polarized. So I believe what's been so fascinating is the last 5 years that AI has been so democratized. It's so easy to learn, and that there's been this technical generosity that, companies have put huge amount of effort into open sourcing the basic tools. So if you take the combination of that sort of availability of open source, hands-on options of learning, and you combine it with the technical generosity of all of the great training, the Coursera, like I learned AI taking Andrew Ng's Coursera course, and it was a fundamental, it was such a mind change for me to realize, that the mathematics that I'd used in my last career for making chips could be applied in this way. I think the best way is to get people. I'm a big believer, by the way, that kids, proto-humans, younger humans, what's the politically correct term for that? But yeah, I think exactly you can start having those conversations in middle school or even before, because, first of all, you need to have people understand the ethical decisions they're making by using social media. But I think you can warn them about the dangers, because I think they really need to understand how technology can be good or bad. But then I think you can start to engage people to explore it in a hands-on way. Now, granted, a very relatively small percentage of them are going to be AI researchers, but I think you can talk to people about the fun and power. I'm a big believer in play and trying to engage people, to try to sort of crack it open and lean in a little bit and have more nuanced conversations. But I think it's really, you have to be able to get people to do sort of hands-on experiential understanding of AI, so that they understand not only the power, but they also understand the limitations. And it's I think the key trouble there is that we have this embarrassment of riches. There's so many resources out there, and they're so accessible, and whatever level you want to do, whether you want to do thought experiments, you want to use a tool, you want to write a tool, et cetera, there's so many places that we somehow have to figure out how to get that into sort of public consumption, recognizing that you got to meet people where they are. You're not going to make everybody start writing code. But I do think that it's, like any other introduction of a technology, like electricity, it takes some getting used to. You have to understand what it's good for and what it's not. But anyway, I'm very excited. I spend a lot of time writing tools for people. I can share one with the audience. I'll put it in the chat. It's a toy that you can run on your phone that you make musical instruments, and then we show the source code. So we've got an advanced high school kind of curriculum around it. But I don't think there's one answer to this, but I think, starting to have meaningful conversations with young people as a vector for sort of influencing the rest of the world is one way to do it. But I don't think there's one solution here. Be interested to hear what you think, Reid.
Yeah, what I think about how you get people involved or educated.
Yeah. In terms of like incorporating ethics as part of the curriculum or as part of the learning process, because these are the people, like this is the generation who's going to build companies, consume services, so they need to look at both sides of the story.
Yeah. So when it comes to AI ethics, one question is, what are your interests? I mean, there's one question about the youth, which just be, let's just expose them to a bunch of stuff. People who are looking to, get a job in this area or work in this area in some significant way. One question is, what are your interests? And that should guide to some extent what you should go start reading about and learning about. I come at it from, I'm trying to get businesses to move, right? I'm trying to move businesses to adopt better practices for AI ethical safety, something like that, right? And so the language that I speak in is typically tailored to that audience. But and then I don't talk that much, a little bit, but I don't talk that much about, say, the unemployment risk due to automation. So if I were, on the other hand, primarily in the world of regulators, then that's what I would talk a lot about. So one thing is that you want to figure out, okay, do I want to be sort of, and then if I were an activist, I'd talk about some other subset of all the AI ethical risk issues. So one thing is to figure out, okay, where in the space do I really find my interests are? Is it with law? Is it with being an activist? Is it with working with businesses? So on and so forth. So that's the first thing to say. And then there are different outlets publish different kinds of things that are going to be relevant to you. But the more general thing to say here is that read the research. A lot of people, their heart is filled with love, right? And so they want to go do a bunch of good in the world. And they're like, I'm going to go get a job and I'm going to go do good. I'm against bias and discrimination. And that's great, but you're going to have to do your intellectual due diligence. You have to, read the kinds of things that John and his colleagues put out. Understand the way that the technology works. Understand the intellectual work that has been done on things like machine learning bias identification, the various quote unquote definitions of fairness, where those come from, why they're good in particular use cases and not in some other cases. But my experience has been that people just want to do the good, or they want to do the not bad, but they don't want to do the intellectual work that is required to actually have a deep understanding of the problem, which is a requirement for making the right choices about how to do the good in the first place. So read the research.
That's a great idea. So we have like 4 minutes remaining. I think a chance for one question probably. The question I got asked was like, AI penetration is still very low in business. What is the impediment? John.
For me, I think part of the impediment is trust. Well, I think there are many. I mean, they're natural technical impediments. And I think that it's like any technologies. You have people who know how to do it. People who actually have the authentic need, and we're just starting to make that intersection where people can use AI to do meaningful things in business. But I think there's also an acceptance. Having spent time in working in industry and in healthcare, a lot of times when you're bringing AI in and you're asking people to trust an AI and relegating important decisions, business decisions, safety decisions, life and limb decisions to an AI, you have to really build trust. So I think one of the things, maybe an impediment, is that we jump ahead and we try to over automate. We try to make something, to make a decision for someone without actually clearly explaining why we're doing it. And like in a medical case, trying to get doctors to use AI, they're like, I spent a lot of time learning this. So there's an emotional, reluctance to do it, but also I think a legitimate, concern that, I'm going to relegate this decision to something that I can't explain itself. Maybe I won't. So I think we have to spend more time putting humans in the center of the AI at the early stages to build adoption. I think we try to overstep that a little bit.
One question for Reid. Are there going to be any metrics that will be derived from, like, can there be like ethical company, like a green company? Like, do you see that happening?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you.
Yeah, I mean, there are, various kinds of certifications, especially for particular algorithms. I'm skeptical. Look, there's certifications or potential certifications around particular models. And then there's a different kind of conversation, or different kind of certification around certifying a business as a whole or an organization. So, that would be more like almost like lead certification or something along those lines. Yeah, there's lots of talk about this stuff. I still think it's at the very early stages. There are companies out there who do quote unquote algorithmic audits, and they can give you a kind of seal, or they can give a report. HireVue, actually, this was in the news very recently. HireVue hired Cathy O'Neill's firm, Orca. Cathy O'Neill is the woman who wrote Weapons of Mass Destruction. Has an algorithmic auditing company, provided some kind of audit of one of HireVue's techniques, but they said they gave it a thumbs up, but it was the criticism is that it was a small subset of the range of things that HireVue does. So the question is whether the algorithmic audit actually helped, or whether it helped, helped ethically speaking, or did it help only to obscure HireVue's unethical practices. So anyway, there's organizations who are doing this kind of thing. HERS, IEEE is working on certifications. It's at its infancy though. At this point, I think it's too soon to tell what's going to happen with those. The EU is also coming out with regulations. They had a white paper back in this past summer. They have a new draft coming out, I think April 21st. And there's some kind of talk, there was talk about certification in a white paper. We'll see if it holds in the new thing that comes out in late April, but there'll probably be some kind of certification process. I don't know. I'm sort of skeptical about it. I think not about its existence, but about its efficacy.
Awesome. It's up time. Thank you so much. Great conversation. I think, as I mentioned, we can go for hours and we have a lot to talk, but I sincerely thank you for your time and your insights and sharing your thought, your analysis with the audience. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Nagaraj. Great meeting you, Reid.
Yeah, you as well, John. Great to meet you. Thanks, Nagaraj. And yeah, this was really fun. And if anyone wants to reach out, they have questions, trenchant criticism, you're welcome to reach out to me.
Yeah, likewise.